Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes renting fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Welcome, everyone, to the Straight Shift. Today, we are going to talk about leasing. To lease or not to lease? That is a question that I get asked all the time. I get people calling me saying, I'm thinking about leasing, or I've heard, that leasing's not a smart financial decision. What do you think? Or worse, I'll get someone calling me saying, I'm in my lease and I need to get out of it, but I'm already over my mileage. What do I do? So I wanted to spend today's podcast talking about what leasing really is. What are the pros and cons? What are the risks? Who is a good lease candidate? Who is not? And hopefully kind of demystify leasing. And interspersed in all this, you are going to get my personal do's and don'ts of leasing. There are quite a few don'ts. So let's just get started. Let's talk about what leasing really is as a concept. Leasing is simply another way of financing a car. When you buy a car and you get a loan for it, because not everybody can pay cash for a car these days, let's just face it. When you buy a car and you finance it, you are financing the total price of the car. Yes, you may put some money down, but for the sake of argument here, let's say we're financing the whole thing. You finance the entire amount of the car. So you take what you paid for it and all the taxes and fees and all that stuff, and you apply that to a certain loan term, 48 months, 60 months, 72 months. Please don't do that. And there's an interest rate, and then that gives you your magical monthly payment. Leasing is actually quite similar. However, instead of financing the entire price of the car, you are only financing part of the car. Because with leasing, you're basically saying, I don't really want to use the whole car. I just want to use part of the car, like for part of the time. So I would really like to just kind of borrow it for, say, 36 months. And I promise not to put more than 36,000 miles on it in that time period. And I'll pay a monthly fee to borrow this car. And then I'm going to give it back to you at the end. So that's what leasing is. You are essentially renting the car for 3 years. And people will say, okay, so leasing, you don't own the car, but if you buy it, you do own the car. Well, technically that's true. However, if you buy a car and you finance it, the bank actually owns your car. In most states, they hold on to that title until you pay it off. So you don't really own a car until it's paid off anyway. So don't really think about leasing versus buying in terms of owning or not owning. You really don't own it anyway unless you're paying cash. But with leasing, you are just paying for the portion of the car that you intend to use for a certain period of time. That is why there are some variables in the lease calculations that are critically important. Number one is the selling price of the car. A lot of people make the mistake when they're leasing because they're just thinking about the monthly payment. And I'll talk a little bit later about why looking at leasing simply to try and get a lower monthly payment is a very dangerous idea, and that should not be why you look to lease a car. But we all look at our monthly budgets. We look at monthly payments because, we're just looking to make sure that the money coming in versus the money going out every month works out. So looking at that monthly lease payment, people will forget, or they may not even realize that you can and absolutely should negotiate the sales price of that car, because the lower that sales price, the better the lease is going to be, just like the lower your monthly payment would be on a loan. So rule number one, do negotiate the price of the car. Some manufacturers will have different rebates based on whether you're buying or leasing. So whether you're buying or leasing may determine that final sales price depending on what kind of rebates the manufacturer has. Sometimes they will have more rebates for leasing. Sometimes they will have more rebates for buying. But when you go to buy a car or lease a car, you should know what all the incentives are before you get in there. And if you don't, go back and listen to my other podcasts where I preach about that. But make sure that you know what money is on the table, what incentives are in play, and negotiate down that sales price, because that's going to make whether you lease or buy more attractive. The next variable in leasing that is critically important, and it really is the crux of what leasing is the residual value. The residual value is how much does the manufacturer and their captive finance company think that that car is going to be worth on the secondary market at the end of the leasing period. Let's just, for argument's sake, 36 months, 3 years. And if you have put, say, 36,000 miles on it, that's a 12,000 mile a year lease. That's pretty much your average. What is that car going to be worth? And they look at the history that they have of their cars and that particular vehicle, and they make that estimate, and they look at the market and they look at future market factors. There's people that are probably paid way more money than me to come up with these residual values. And that means that every car is going to have every model and even different trim levels within a certain model. Like if you get the one with leather and a sunroof, it's going to have a higher residual than one that doesn't, because it's going to have a higher resale value because it has things that people want in a used car. So that residual is really, really critical, and it's set by the manufacturer, and it's not negotiable. It is what it is, but you need to look at that number to help determine if that car is a good car to lease, because not all cars are good cars to lease. For a car to be a good vehicle to lease, it needs to have two things. Number one, it needs to have a good resale value. So cars that traditionally have good resale value, like Hondas, Toyotas, Lexus, Acura, they tend to be good cars to lease because they have a naturally higher residual because people like to buy them used. But number two is the captive finance company for that manufacturer, Honda Financial, Lexus Financial, whoever it is, those are the people that do the leasing. They have to have a strong program. Really, it has to be a strong finance company, and it also has to have a strong lease program for that car. For example, BMW has one of the best leasing programs in the industry. It's probably because that's the only way that they can sell cars because they're so expensive, but they have a very strong captive finance company. So many of the vehicles that they move are leased, not traditionally purchased. So what they will sometimes do is what's called holding up that residual. They'll look at the market and say, this 3 Series BMW, we're expecting it to be worth this amount of money at the end of 3 years, but instead we're going to give them a little bit more. Maybe they do their math and say, I think it's going to be, worth, the residual is going to be 56%. And that residual, that percentage is always of MSRP. Doesn't matter what you negotiate as a sales price, the residual is always calculated off the MSRP. So they think, it'll be worth 56, but we're going to put a residual of 59% on this lease because we want to make the leasing more attractive. The higher the residual, the less money you will be paying per month on that lease. So the more you negotiate that sales price to get that down, and then the higher residual that the manufacturer sets, the better off you are because you're financing less money. You're financing that just one piece of the car that you're going to use, and that you want to minimize that as much as possible. So what's a good residual? Anything over 50% means the car is a decent car to lease. If you go below 50%, if it's like a 48% residual, which you'll see a lot in American cars, sadly, most American cars are terrible to lease. There will be certain models that are pretty decent because the manufacturer puts a good program on them, but traditionally the American cars are not as good to lease because they don't have as high a resale value, and their captive finance companies are not as strong. So look at that number. If the residual is over 55%, that's good. That's perfectly acceptable. If it's over 60%, woohoo, that's going to be a really strong lease. So make sure that you ask, if you are negotiating a lease with a dealer, ask for that residual. The other number you need to ask for that is critical to these calculations is the money factor. The money factor is the leasing equivalent of an interest rate. And you can actually take the money factor. You'll have to ask for it. They don't share this information voluntarily. You have to know to ask in a lease. A money factor is going to be a weird looking number like 0.00125. Well, what the heck does that mean? You take that weird little number, multiply it by 2,400. And I am not going to get into the math that goes into why it's 2,400. Just please trust me and take your money factor of 0.00125, multiply it by 2,400, and that will equate to about 3%. So that's how you can take a money factor and translate it into an interest rate that will actually make sense to your brain and that you can compare to traditional auto loan rates in the market. So if that money factor equates to an interest rate that is as strong as or better than traditional auto loan rates, that's a good thing. Leasing the car, you don't want that to cost you more than buying the car, because then it doesn't make sense to lease anymore. So if you get the residual, you get the money factor, that will give you an idea of whether or not this vehicle is good to lease. Now, keep in mind on leasing, there are some other fees in there. They will typically charge an acquisition fee that is charged by the finance company. You can't get out of paying that typically. Just understanding what goes into that lease calculation. A lease calculation is not something that you're going to be able to really do on your own. It's not like a traditional standard car loan where you can go to bankrate.com or any variety of websites that have a loan calculator. It's a simple interest loan. You plug in the amount financed, the interest rate, and the term, and boom, it spits out a monthly payment. Leasing calculations are a little more complicated than that. And there are a few lease calculators out there on the internet, but how leasing is calculated varies a little bit by state. In some states like North Carolina, and we're just going to call it sales tax. It's really a use tax, but we're just going to be simple here and call it a sales tax. North Carolina, you buy a car, you pay 3% tax on it. In North Carolina, that 3% tax is applied to every monthly payment, but not to the whole car. So not only, are you maybe making a lower monthly payment because you're leasing, one of the benefits in certain states is that you're not paying taxes on the full price of the car either, which is great. Now, there are other states where you have to pay tax on the full amount of the car up front. It's not rolled into the monthly lease payment. Therefore, because leasing varies by state, South Carolina is one of those states, but the taxes are capped out at $500 anyway, so it's actually a good thing. So you tend to have lower lease payments in South Carolina than you do in North Carolina on the same car. So all that just comes down to is that the leasing calculation is a little bit more complicated. I'm a nerd. I built a spreadsheet that actually does all that complicated math so that I can at least get a good estimate of what lease payments are without having to rely on the dealer, but you'll have to rely on the dealer for those numbers. Okay. So we've talked about the residual. We've talked about the money factor. We've talked about what cars are good to lease and which ones are not good to lease. But the biggest factor of whether or not you should lease is whether or not you, as a person, are a good lease candidate. Now, what do I mean about a good lease candidate? A good lease candidate is someone that drives 12,000 miles a year or less consistently. And they know that. They've tracked their mileage in the past. They have a very stable living and working situation, so that mileage is not likely to change drastically over the term of the lease, over the next 3-year horizon. If you drive up to 15,000 miles a year, you can get away with leasing. The lease payment will be higher because you're putting more miles on the car. The residual will therefore be lower. But, if you start driving a lot of miles, then it doesn't make sense to lease anymore. I say if you're kind of waffling between should I buy or should I lease, number one, ask yourself, how many miles a year do I drive? And do you really know? It's amazing. A lot of people really don't know how many miles per year they drive. They don't really pay attention to it. So that's something that, you should look at anyway. But, if you drive, more than the average of 12,000 miles a year, leasing might not be the right solution for you. I would encourage you to look at both options, do a lease versus buy analysis and see, what the difference in the monthly payment would be. I did that a number of years ago when I was looking at buying an Infiniti sports car. That was a really fun car, let me tell you. I just did the math. Infiniti's the luxury brand of Nissan. They didn't have the best leasing program, and especially on this particular car. So I looked at it, and it was like $5 a month difference in the monthly payment between leasing it and buying it. And I'm like, well, heck with that. I'm just going to buy it. So it's important to do that analysis and make sure. But you really need to understand what your mileage is, because that's the biggest risk of leasing, is going over your mileage. I'm going to take a really quick break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about, even if you are a good lease candidate, is that a smart financial decision? What are the pros and cons of leasing that need to go into that? What are some of the big risks? And what are your options if you get into trouble? And even what are your options at the end of the lease that the automotive industry does not want you to know about? So, real quick break. I'll be right back. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a fair price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 888-575-2138. That's 888-575-2138. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Where the rubber meets the road.
Nice to meet you. Love your asphalt. Hey, nice treads.
It's Straight Shift with the Car Chick.
Welcome back, folks. We are talking about leasing today and whether or not that is a good idea or not. A lot of your financial planners will make a blanket statement and say, leasing is a bad financial decision. And I respect why they say that. They are coming from a purely monetary, looking at saving your money, maximizing your wealth over time, planning for the future. And so looking at it from their perspective, they're not wrong. That is a statement that they have every right to make. I don't tend to adhere to black and white rules pretty much anywhere in my life, and my driving record kind of shows that. But whether or not to lease is more of a lifestyle decision. So, as I said before the break, if you drive preferably 12,000 miles or less per year, then leasing could be an option for you because you are a lower risk of going over that mileage. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right decision for you and your lifestyle. Some people do like to keep a car for, they say until the wheels fall off. I have actually driven a wheel off a car on a racetrack, and let me tell you, that's not actually fun. So I don't even like that saying anymore. It's not as funny as it sounds when it happens in real life. But people who like to keep cars for a long time and keep them for 200,000 miles, and to them, that's a smart financial decision. It works for them. That's great. That's what their financial planner probably wants them to do anyway. But there are a lot of people who, frankly, just like cars. And they want to have the latest and greatest stuff all the time. And they get bored with their car easily, and they want something new every few years. And they really don't want to deal with the hassle of, maintenance other than your basic fluid changes and some wipers and maybe a new set of tires or brakes. They don't want to get into those unexpected repair costs that start to happen as your car gets a little bit older and gets a little more miles on it. And if that's a priority for you, and you have the monthly cash flow and the overall financial picture where you can afford to just have a car payment for the rest of your life, or at least the foreseeable future, that's perfectly fine. Everybody has different priorities in their life. So I always evaluate whether or not, a prospective client is a good lease candidate or not based on their unique situation. And that's the way you should look at it. Certainly talk to your financial person, but it's a lifestyle decision. If you are looking at leasing purely because you are trying to have a lower monthly payment, that is probably going to be a bad idea. Leasing should not really be used as a strategy to get into a fancier car or more car than you can really afford at a lower price if you don't meet the mileage requirements for that car, or if your lifestyle isn't consistent. I have seen a lot of people get in really deep trouble leasing, and most of these people have been in some sort of sales jobs. Realtors, I'm going to pick on you here for a minute, but realtors are often the worst culprits for getting in trouble in leasing because they want to drive that nicer car because they're in it all the time, and their clients see it all the time. And so it's a reflection of their success and the perception that, oh, if they drive a fancier car, they must be really successful. They're going to be a better realtor. They're going to get me a higher price for my car. They're better at their job. So I get why they want to have that nicer car for their professional image. However, I've never met a realtor that drives less than 20,000 miles a year. So they frequently get themselves in trouble. And, unless they've been in the business and are really well established, their income may vary drastically throughout the year, depending on how the market's doing. So, being locked into a lease payment on a swanky car and they're racking up the miles, they just get themselves into so much trouble. Really, anyone who drives a lot of miles is going to get themselves in trouble on leasing. And that's really the biggest risk of leasing, is when you go over your miles, there is a penalty to that. And when you sign the lease contract, they will tell you exactly how much each individual mile is going to hurt you if you go over it. And in a minute, I'll get to what are some ways to fix that problem if you are into it, or to have a mitigation plan in place if you decide, okay, I'm going to lease for these reasons now, but if something changes, I have a plan to deal with that if it happens. Because, in addition to the benefit of having a new car every few years and not having to deal with the higher maintenance costs and surprise repair bills, the risk of that residual value being different than what was anticipated in the lease goes to the leasing company. They accept that risk. And they can do that because they're leasing a bazillion cars, and over their whole portfolio, they're probably not going to lose their butts. Well, that has happened a number of years ago, if you remember, and when the financial markets collapsed and we had all this snafu in the mortgage industry, and everything kind of got turned upside down around 2009, and after the markets went to heck in a handbasket in late 2008. A lot of the American manufacturers, if you recall, we had to bail their butts out. The big bailout for GM and Chrysler. One of the things that happened was their finance companies had just really stretched themselves too thin. They had offered leases that were just not working. And so they actually stopped offering leases for a time period until they kind of recovered. And, those companies are still not necessarily the best companies to provide good leases. But, all that risk was put onto the finance company. So, one thing that can happen in a lease is, God forbid, you get into an accident and your car's totaled. Well, if you have a traditional loan for that car and your insurance company pays you, say, $20,000, but you still owe $26,000 on the loan, that gap of $6,000 is your problem. If you are in a leased car and the leased car is totaled, you just kind of walk away from it in most cases, because the leasing company, they have built-in insurance to help them deal with those situations. It's obviously frustrating for you, but it does push some of that risk onto the leasing company. But there are a lot of risks to leasing with people's lives are just not that consistent anymore. I mean, things change. We lose our jobs. There's a whole bunch of people right now furloughed, with the government shutdown, who are not being able to make their monthly car payments. So life happens. And when you have a lease, I said in the beginning that you're only basically financing a portion of the car, not the whole car. So what that happens is you are not really paying off much principal at all on the car. And cars depreciate most rapidly at the very beginning. So even if you have a regular car loan and you finance it for 60 months or, God forbid, 72 months, those first couple of years are going to be pretty iffy. You're going to be upside down on that loan because the car is going to depreciate faster than you pay it off. With a lease, unless you are way under your miles because you only drive like 5,000 miles a year, like my mother, you're going to be upside down on that car. So, if you get 2 years into a 3-year lease and suddenly life has happened and something has changed, you have kids now and this, little car you leased isn't going to work anymore, or you're going through a divorce and your situation's changed. You've got to get out of this car for some reason financially. You got a different job and now you're driving twice as many miles to get to your work location. Life happens. And so you have a greater risk with the lease because you're not going to be able to get out of it as easily as you might be able to get out of a car that you have financed traditionally obviously depending on how long you financed it for. So getting out of a lease when you need to can put you in a significant financial pickle. And I have seen people get into that pickle because life happened to them. So that is the biggest risk of leasing. You may get stuck in it if your life changes around you and you can't afford that lease payment anymore, or you're over your mileage, but you're stuck. You're not completely stuck. There are some things that you can do to get out of these situations depending on how upside down you are. Now, a lot of people will, if they've had some negative equity on their previous car, let's say, and they rolled that negative equity into the lease. Sometimes certain car salespeople will tell you, oh, well, no problem. Here's how we're going to fix that. We'll just roll the negative equity into the lease and you'll just make a little bit higher lease payments. But at the end of 3 years, that negative equity is gone and you walk away scot-free. That is true. And that can work for some people. My argument is you got yourself into a negative equity situation on your last car. There's probably a good chance that you're going to do it again. Unless you're really disciplined and, you really make a concerted effort and your life is consistent, but it's a high risk. So I don't recommend rolling in any negative equity into a new car deal, whether you're buying or leasing, but rolling it into a lease can put you at greater risk during the lease because you are basically paying for 2 cars at the same time and you're not going to be able to get out of it if something happens in your life. So let's say you are in a lease and you're way over your miles. What do you do? That depends on what options are offered by the finance company. Some captive finance companies like BMW Financial, they will actually allow you to renegotiate the lease one time during the lease. So let's say you have a BMW and you're over your miles. You call them up and be like, I need more miles. And they will say, okay, well, how many more miles do you need? And they will actually renegotiate your lease to say, I think when I turn in the car, I'm actually going to have 50,000 miles on it instead of 36,000. Okay, no problem. They will do that. Your monthly payment is just going to go way up. But some companies will at least offer you that option. And or they may offer you say, well, you can pay the mileage overage at this lower rate than it was in your contract, as long as you pay for them before you turn the lease in. Even, an hour before you turn it in, as long as you buy those miles ahead of time, you can buy them at, say, 15 cents a mile instead of the 25 cents a mile that we said we would charge you if you were over when you turned the car in. So step number 1, if you're in a situation where you're over your miles on your lease, is to call your leasing company and see if they have any options for you, because they might. Typically, it's the really strong leasing companies, and BMW is one of the only ones that I've seen have so much flexibility, but it never hurts to ask. If that is not an option, then you can look at refinancing the car, and it's essentially like buying out your lease early. And what the bank will do is they will just look at what is the loan to value and handle it just like if you were refinancing a traditional loan. Depending on the laws for your state on how leasing works will depend on whether or not you've got to pay taxes and yada, yada. But go to your bank and say, I'm in a lease, I'm a little over my miles. Can I refinance it and get a traditional loan from you guys? That can be a stopgap measure in an emergency. And then it'll convert over to a normal loan. And, it's basically like you're buying your own used car. So that can be an option to get you out of a real pickle just in case. You end up having to keep the car because you're still going to be way upside down on it on the loan too, but it can work to, help you get out of that lease. And, if the miles were going to be a lot at the end, I've seen people owe $12,000 at the end of a lease in overage charges alone. I kid you not. So if you find yourself, you're in a lease, you're stuck, you're not sure what to do, but you're kind of in trouble, feel free to reach out to me. You can go to my website at thecarchick.com, set up a time to talk to me. I'm happy to talk through your situation and see and assess what your options are. Sometimes you may just be stuck, but there's a lot more options than the automotive industry wants you to know about, or that they will just at least tell you about voluntarily. Now that comes to options at the end of your lease. There are more options at the end of a lease than you know about, whether you're, no matter where your miles are. Typically, they just tell you, oh, you got to turn in your lease. The first thing I always ask a new client of mine who they're saying, oh, my lease is ending, and I need to get a new car. I say, great. How many miles, are you over your miles? Are you under your miles? If you didn't drive as many miles and your car, held its value really well, and depending on what the residual was at the time of the lease, if it was one of those that they held up that was abnormally high, then, it may not make a difference. But if you're under your mileage on a lease, there's a chance that the residual value, the actual residual value, meaning what you can get for selling it, trading it in, may be higher than the residual of the lease. That's called having equity in the car. That's no different than if you have a loan for the car. And let's say, you owe $20,000 on the loan, but the car's worth $25,000 on trade. That $5,000 difference, that's equity. That's cash money in your pocket that goes towards the down payment on the next car. That equity is yours. In a leasing situation in most states, that equity is still yours. The leasing company just doesn't want you to know that because they want that equity because it helps them offset all the cars that they're going to lose money on when those leases get traded in. So always do an equity analysis on your vehicle before you just blindly turn in your lease to see if you have any equity. And if you do, then negotiate your trade simply as a trade. You don't even have to tell them it's a leased car. Find out what you can get for it on trade. And if there's positive equity, great, that is yours. And then whatever the lease payoff is, that's just like a loan payoff. Then the dealer pays that off, but any positive equity stays in your pocket, can be used as a down payment on that next deal. You don't always have to literally buy out the lease and then turn around and sell it. You can trade in a leased car in most situations. And if there is positive equity, that positive equity is yours. You just have to know how to approach the negotiations the right way to make sure that that happens. But most people don't even know that that's possible. So if you're coming to the end of a lease, don't just blindly turn it in. Find out if there's any equity that belongs to you. And if there's not, great. You turn it in, you walk away from it, no big deal. A couple other things about leasing that you need to know. Number one, you have to have good credit to lease. You don't have to have perfect credit. They do have tiers, and it depends on that manufacturer and how strong they are. Honda has a great captive finance company, and so if you're leasing a Honda or an Acura, they have several tiers. So if you don't have perfect credit, but it's decent credit, then if it's maybe 650, 670, you can still lease. Your equivalent interest rate will be higher, and so your monthly payment will be higher, but they can still usually get the lease approved. Not every company can do that, so it's just best to know that you have to have good, if not great, credit to lease, because it's just a higher risk to the leasing company. Therefore, they're only going to make that nice offer to people that they feel are a lower financial risk to them. So number one, you have to have pretty good credit to lease. Another thing you need to know about leasing is that you have to take good care of that car. They can charge you at the end of the lease excessive wear and tear, and all that information is spelled out in the beginning in your lease contract, and the dealer needs to go over that with you. By law, they have to. So be sure you understand, you have to do the maintenance as in the maintenance program. You don't have to do your maintenance at the dealership. Some leasing companies will offer you some deals that will make it more attractive. That way it reduces their risk because they know you're coming into the dealership to get it done. You don't have to go to the dealership, but you do have to follow the manufacturer's maintenance schedule and do everything you're supposed to do all of your oil changes, and, not beat up the car. A little bit of wear and tear is considered normal. And I have found, quite frankly, it really depends on who inspects your car at the end of the lease. You're not going to be able to go change out a bunch of stuff, put a bunch of aftermarket parts on it. It needs to stay a stock car. Now, that being said, in the past, when I released a Porsche, I didn't do that. I actually did make some changes, but the person that was inspecting the car barely knew the front bumper from the back bumper and just didn't notice any of these things. So it wasn't an issue. But, keep the car stock, keep it in good shape. if you do get into an accident, you got to make sure it gets repaired. So there will be an inspection of the car at the end of the lease. And if you have any excessive wear and tear, and that is determined by a checklist that the inspector goes through. The manufacturer will set the parameters of what is acceptable, how many light scratches and or little paint chips per body panel are you allowed to have and how many total. Some of them get really, really quantitative on this. Some of them it's like, yeah, it looks pretty decent. It's good. So it really depends, but know that there will be an inspection at the end of your lease. And if you're turning it in, they are going to look at that car and make sure you haven't beat the hell out of it. So take good care of your car if you lease. That will deter a lot of parents from leasing. If you got a leased car and you're going to have kids in it that are going to tear it up, then leasing might not be the best option. Or just get the car detailed once a month, once a quarter, depending on how messy you are, and keep that car in good shape. I say that you should do that no matter what, because you should take care of your car, but there will be a penalty at the end of that lease if you don't. So I hope that this has answered some questions you may have had about leasing, demystified it a little bit, debunked some myths, and you got some good do's and don'ts of leasing. So again, if you're considering getting a new car and you're thinking maybe about leasing, but you're not sure if it's right for you, just give me a call. Go to my website, thecarchick.com, set up a time to talk to me. And if you're not a good lease candidate, I am going to be brutally honest with you and just tell you no. I have no problems telling people, no, you're not a good lease candidate. Don't do it. So, folks, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful 2019. And until we meet again, drive safely.
The Straight Shift Podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or The Car Chick.